This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me, you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend. I've walked your snow-capped mountains.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is December 10th, 2020, and this is episode 219.
I'm Scott Delunnebaum.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, we get the first majority government Horgan NDP throne speech, and people are getting vaccines for Christmas. Probably not you, but a couple people. Thank you to the 100 people who contribute to the show every month. Thanks to Angelo for signing up as a new patron. You can join Angelo and 99 other cool people who make this show possible and join our Slack community by signing up at patreon.com/Politicoast. Politicoast is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicoast enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. Let's talk about this short speech for a short session. The fall 2020 legislative session is already half over. There's 4 days left of an 8-day session, which means talking about the throne speech on Monday feels like it was a lifetime ago in this parliament, but technically they've only introduced that and one other bill other than the pro forma Bill 1 supremacy of parliament thing.
Oh, you wouldn't want to forget that one.
Alberta doesn't even do that
the queen
one.
of her place.
Like, some parliaments don't even do that one because it never gets passed. Anyway,
I like it. Traditions are important.
The throne speech, therefore, had to be said. It had to have a lot of pomp and circumstance, and it had to commemorate those who've lost, and it had to, more importantly, in the government's eyes, maybe, commemorate all the things they have done, because that's all it seemed to do.
Yeah, so if you were to strip out everything that is basically just repeating the greatest hits of the government's pandemic response, probably would have been a 5-minute speech, if that.
And we've criticized multiple governments now on this podcast for this feature of a throne speech. I don't think we're ever going to lose it. Governments really like either patting themselves on the back or wagging their finger at their opposition and framing it as, here's how we will not be them. I watched it live and there was nothing that jumped out to me as new or particular. Like, it was, as you say, what they have been doing, as well as some of the things in the election promise, like the MRI machines and giving the BC recovery benefit, the Horgan bucks, as I'll call them.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing to come out of the highly truncated fall session. And even a lot of the platform promises didn't really make it into the throne speech at all.
We will get another throne speech in January or February or whenever this comes back, but yeah, anything jump out at you?
So it was broken down into 2 parts, protecting people's health and protecting people's livelihood. On the first one, no, nothing at all jumped out at me. It was pretty much exactly what you'd expect. If anything, it was a little light on the details of what the next stages are going to be. On the protecting people's livelihoods, that's where the Horgan butts come in. Like, for the most part, it was also more or less the same thing. The only thing of note, really, that came out of there for me was the give renters a bit more financial breathing room. So sounds like probably when, not in this session, but shortly after, they're going to be bringing in that renters rebate. And the other thing is talking about increasing transportation infrastructure investments, which is a bit of a different tone than they were taking back in late spring, early summer, when the recovery planning really started, when the line out of the government was infrastructure is not a priority for our recovery.
It is nice to see. Like, they also did talk about expanding childcare and early childhood education. So balancing those two together, I think, is a good initial roadmap. And especially as this government starts to look at Clean BC and building back better, or whatever cliche you want to use.
I think that's the Biden Trudeau line.
Yeah. Investing in transit is a good thing to do.
So, do you think the throne speech is going to make any impact at all?
I think we've already forgotten about it, even though it was only read 3 days ago.
And not only that, even in like the best case scenario, unless there's something truly shocking in there, it's basically for the people who work in the ledge, the reporters there, the very highly politically engaged. Almost nobody else even pays attention to these.
Yeah, and so the legislature spent quite a while debating this because it does have to pass and it does have to be debated first. It did give a number of new MLAs a chance to make their debut speeches in the legislature. I saw some things from Renee Merrifield, the new MLA for Kelowna Mission for the BC Liberals, had some interesting takes. She's their new health critic, so she really tried to focus in a positive way, I would say, on having a more preventative approach to healthcare, although I think there was some naivete in there, as she had said some quip about wanting a healthcare system where MRIs aren't necessary, which, as someone whose child had 2 MRIs in the last month for diagnostic reasons, we're going to need MRIs.
So unless the proposal is to make something that's even better than an MRI, I just can't follow that at all.
Is that a CT scan? I don't know enough about medical imaging. They do different things, obviously.
They work on different principles, so I think they're different. Yeah. I don't know. Radiologists can write in and correct us.
The other challenge for the legislature is there was only one bill introduced so far, which was Bill 3. So there hasn't been a Bill 2, which I assume is going to be the supply bill to actually get money going. But even before they wanted to get money moving, the tabling of Bill 3 meant that they could push the need to do a budget back until April, rather than, I think, having to introduce it fairly early, like February or March, and until the end of April. The claim from the government is that the economy will still be too uncertain in the spring, and it'd be worthwhile to see how vaccines start to roll out before we really present numbers to the province about how we're doing.
At no point in the next year is there going to be a period without uncertainties. So you might as well do it now, especially because that was the argument that Horgan made about why he even called the election at all, was the need to increase certainty and have a strong, stable government to get stuff done. If they're not actually going to do that, what was the point?
I think there was also some accusation from the Liberals that, and I don't know how deeply this is true, but that calling the election further pushes the budget away. Budgets are big documents that get underway early in the spring. I think it started in June this past year and has been consulted on, and a lot of the priorities were coming forward. And given that the NDP was elected on a fairly status quo mandate, the budget won't be changed that much, other than maybe they can be a little more ambitious or less deferential to what the Greens would have wanted. But it's still just a throw money at people to keep the economy running kind of budget. So I'm not sure why they want to delay it. It's not a great look to start off on. And so we are still waiting to see the actual bill to make the recovery benefit happen, as far as I can tell. Nevertheless, the BC Government News released a press release announcing that on December 18th, the applications for this benefit will open. So you'll have to go online and apply, claim, use your 2019 income, it turns out, to say whether you qualify for this.
Yeah, so the overall benefit is $1,000 for families with incomes under $125,000, and that's going to decrease down to zero for families with $175,000 in income. And for single people, $62,500 gets you $500. And if you make over $87,500, you get nothing. And it likewise has a sliding scale there.
We couldn't figure out the exact way the sliding scale works. I'm pretty sure it'll be linear, but nothing documents if it's...
Formulas were not shared.
Sometimes there are like cutoffs where they step down, but to be determined.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So the two things to note here aren't really so much the money, it's the fact that they're using the 2019 income to base this on. Now, a lot of times that would make a fair bit of sense, but this has been a rather unprecedented year, and much more so than normal. You can't necessarily correlate past year's income with current year's income. In that sense, it would perhaps make a lot more sense to either just make it universal, and if Jimmy Patterson makes an extra $1,000 this year, so what? Or alternatively, do a clawback in the following year's taxes or something like that, rather than using pre-pandemic income to sign a pandemic response.
Yeah, they did announce this will be tax-free, I believe. So that's just a nice check you don't have to worry about. The reason for going to the 2019 income, according to the government, and it somewhat makes sense, is that it's just the simplest number if you're going to make this means tested. And every announcement they've made so far has been that it will be that way. The median income in BC for families in 2018 was $87,000. So 125 means you'll get most families. I don't know how many individuals earn over 175,000, or how many families earn over 175, or individuals earn over 87,500. It might be enough that it becomes prohibitively expensive and look weird, and it would take away the BC NDP's ability to claim that they're not supporting yacht owners, as they like to still talk about, because we're still litigating the election. Like, I definitely take the point that there can be people who will get screwed by this, and that's frustrating. I'm still a bit skeptical how big of an issue it will be, because people whose households were making over 125,000 in 2019 are seemingly less likely, by all the stats I've seen, to have been significantly affected by the recession caused by the pandemic, right? Most of the people who've taken the hardest hits have been lower income workers, women, racialized families, and so forth. So the other half of it is people who tend to earn a lot, tend to have a lot, so they can probably cushion themselves a little bit better. Now, there'll definitely be exceptions to that, and that's where the question comes up of, was this the best way to do it? Or was this more of we needed a way to do it fast? The same kind of issue arises with the application process, because an application inherently means some people will miss it. And that's more likely to happen among those who need it the most. And so the government does talk about some efforts that they'll be making, especially in the new year once they have a bit more time, to make sure unhoused people on fixed incomes or otherwise who don't have great internet access will be able to be aware of this and will get their money if they're entitled to it.
Yeah, the people who I think pay the most attention to what the government does and all of this stuff are probably correlated with generally being on the higher income side and wealthier. And not everyone, the higher ends won't obviously be eligible for this, but there'll probably be a lot of people roughly in my position where, like, I'm not going to get the full amount, but I can still get some, especially on last year's income. I'll be going up there on the first day to get, because why not? It's free money. But yeah, the people who are living in the downtown east side, for example, might not be as quick on that or as aware of that. So doing an application process rather than just mailing everybody a check that they have address data for might not capture as many people, particularly on the low end.
The other thing that drew a significant amount of criticism in this announcement was that they slid in there that people on income assistance, disability assistance, and low-income seniors receiving the seniors supplement will receive an additional recovery benefit of $150 per month from January to March 2021. This was criticized because that additional benefit had been $300 from the start of the pandemic support rollout to now. And so it looks like a cut of 50%. Now the government is claiming that because all of those individuals will qualify for the $500 or $1,000, depending on their situation, they will come out roughly slightly better with the 1,000 plus 150 times 3 than they would with 300 times 3 and no 1,000. But for many people, they've pointed out our assistance rates have been abysmal, keeping people with disabilities in the poverty or below the poverty line. And so we've needed to raise the rates for a long time, and not making the $300 increase, which many pointed out was not enough, permanent, feels like a slap in the face to some of the most marginalized people in the province, most hard done by.
It doesn't make a huge amount of sense, in part because just it doesn't really seem to fit with the NDP's general ideological tenor. And also, BC is not exactly in bad financial shape. We could keep that expanded benefit there without really stressing us too much at all financially.
Indeed.
So it just seems like a weird decision to penny pinch now.
Indeed, Moody's just renewed our AAA credit rating, saying we are one of the strongest provinces coming out of the pandemic. Not really coming out of it yet. We're not hurting fiscally.
Yeah, we've had a long streak of balanced budgets. We have a pretty good debt to GDP ratio. Our debt service levels are very, very manageable. And I'm generally pretty reluctant to support borrowing money for current consumption rather than longer term investments the government can make that are going to spur growth and help pay back that debt in the long run. But there's definitely the case here that we're leaving money on the table if we're have a AAA credit rating in a time like this and aren't doing more to borrow money. This is going to be a bit of a hot take, but if 4 years from now the NDP leave with the same credit rating, it's probably going to be a failure on their part that they haven't actually used the resources at their disposal to the fullest extent they can.
I like that. I'll take that.
Like, even the people who want to run governments like a business, if it was the case that a business had that good a credit rating and needed to make a bunch of investments, they would borrow. This government's debt levels would be very lean compared to what a normal business would run at.
I think the thing to watch will be the government's ongoing work on the poverty reduction file, and when the strategy is finalized on that, or the stuff they're working on with basic income and all of these other things, and if that will paint a path that takes advantage of that capacity we have to, frankly, end poverty in this province, because we're rich enough, we don't need to have people live in abject poverty.
The last thing I'll say on the credit rating thing is that the rationale for having a good credit rating, running balanced budgets during the good times and everything is so you have a lot of room when disaster hits. And because of that, this is at the time where you want to be able to draw on all the banked capacity that 16 years of Liberal governments followed by 3 years of the NDP's government and all their fiscal management have left us in that good position. And if you're not going to use it now, you'll never will.
Well, and the last thing I want to touch on with this first week of a 2-week parliament is the other thing that happened was the committees were reformed. The government reformed the Police Act Committee, the committee to study the privacy. There's a committee to amend the Privacy Act and update that, and is in the midst of studying it. We haven't done as much on that, so I'm not as familiar, as well as all the standing committees. The Police Act was interesting. It's unsurprisingly a majority NDP committee, 6 New Democrats, 3 Liberals, and a Green. Doug Rutley was named chair, which was an interesting choice. His background is a mix of industry, business, labor, politics. I think he spent time in Japan. I was reading his bio. Nothing that really screams familiarity with law enforcement on either side, as compared to members like Gary Begg, who's on the committee, who's an ex-RCMP officer, or Roshna Singh, who's the NDP's parliamentary secretary on anti-racism issues, or even the Liberals have Dan Davies, who was ex-Canadian Forces and chairs the North Peace Justice Society, which is a restorative justice organization. It'll be interesting to follow this committee.
Although the SCF thing isn't really particularly pleasurable here.
Yeah, the army and police are different things. I am aware of that. Fair enough.
And we want them to stay that way.
Yeah. The one Green on the committee is Adam Olsen, so it'll be interesting to see where they go, how soon they get their work going. I know there's a lot of organizations like the BC Civil Liberties Association that I'm on the board of that are very eager to say a lot to that committee. And given the debates in Metro Vancouver over police budgets, which you can hear more about on the most recent episode of Canby Report, a lot of people will have a lot of interest in the Police Act reforms, I think. Notably, one of the committees that wasn't reconstituted yet was the Health Committee. And this drew the attention of BC Liberal Mike DeYoung during question period, who asked why that hasn't been reconstituted yet, and if the Premier would put it together to assist the province's vaccine rollout and just generally our COVID response. And Adrian Dix instead said he would commit to work with every single member of the House and on all elements of BC's pandemic response, but he didn't mention the Health Committee. And even beyond the vaccine rollout, the Health Committee does a lot of good work because healthcare is a very big expenditure in this province, like all provinces. I've spoken at the Health Committee before. I want it back.
That's not exactly reassuring. What Dit said is the sort of thing a person in Parliament or the Ledge says when they don't want to actually commit to something but sound like they're being cooperative. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But it's not a great sign, particularly when the pandemic is a little more of a pressing issue than police reform is. And it's a clearly not as big a priority to get that up and running. Moving on to segment 2, vaccines for Christmas. The big news this week is finally getting a vaccine, as it was announced on Tuesday that Health Canada had approved Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine. And that means the first doses are going to be arriving in Canada within the week.
I think we're the third country to approve it. There was the UK was the first, and there's a big press conference of the first woman in the world to get the vaccine outside of a clinical trial. There's not even a lot of controversy or politics to the story. It's just a good light at the end of the tunnel moment, where the tunnel is another 9 months, but
there's some politics about the tunnel that was behind us, but we'll get to that in a moment. Also, the other great thing about the UK and their first dose that I think were administered on Monday wasn't the first person who got it, but it was the second person who got it, a Brit by the name of William Shakespeare, because this is 2020 and even writers wouldn't come up with this stuff.
So BC announced and teased a bit early that Horgan was expecting 4,000 people to get the vaccine next week, as we'll be getting 4 trays of, I think it's 950 or 975 doses. And those will go to long-term care workers first at 2 specific unspecified sites, one in Fraser Health and one in Vancouver Coastal Health. The Pfizer vaccine, as many have commented on, requires intense refrigeration to minus 70 or minus 80. The numbers keep changing, which is a little colder than your average refrigerator, which does like minus 5.
Just slightly. No big deal on that. But no, seriously, the distribution and cold chains has been a concern on this. Pfizer, out of the various vaccines that are approved or near an approval, is the one that needs the coldest storage. So as a result, we'll probably see this get distributed in the kind of major urban areas, and the Moderna vaccine, which is expected to be approved within the next couple of weeks, with deliveries following shortly after, is more likely to be the one that gets distributed in more rural and remote areas.
And so here in BC, we're looking at a coordinated approach with the federal government, who is the one who's essentially giving out the vaccine. And then in BC, we're deciding who gets it. The federal government is talking about vaccinating 125,000 people by the end of the year, 3 million by the end of first quarter next year, up to half of all Canadians by the end of the summer, and then 38 million, pretty much everyone who wants it.
They said half of all Canadians by the end of Q2, which is more like end of June, July. So like by midsummer, we should be hitting the 50% mark. And then at the end of Q3, at the start of October, 38 million people, or basically the entire population of Canada, should be vaccinated by then.
And that's when we can hug each other again.
This is good that Canada's, now that it's approved, moving fairly quickly. We have 20 million doses of this vaccine ordered with an option for 56 million more. So there is a good amount coming down the pipe, and especially now that we're basically, it's just us and Britain, and I think Bahrain was the third on the list of countries that have approved. We should hopefully get a decent chunk of the initial batches coming down on this, which would be great news. And then it's being distributed across Canada on a per capita basis. So we'll be getting vaccinated at roughly the same rate as everywhere else in Canada.
The first people in BC are residents and staff of congregate living settings that provide care for seniors, such as long-term care homes. The residents will be a little bit harder because of the fixed location. You have to go to where the vaccine is, and they don't want to necessarily move every resident back and forth. So I think staff will be the main first focus, but among residents, they'll be targeting residents 70 and older, starting with those 80 and older. After that's done, they'll start moving outward towards all healthcare workers, especially those in acute care and intensive care, as well as adults in Indigenous communities where infections can have disproportionate consequences. The next phase in the new year will be the next line of front care workers. I think this is into the spring. The next line of frontline workers. In the spring, firefighters, paramedics, police, as well as teachers and grocery store workers, I think were mentioned. And then they'll keep expanding the circles as more vaccines come online and as we can roll it out wider. It all makes reasonable sense. I've read different takes on you shouldn't focus as much on the individuals in long-term care as much as you should on the staff, and grocery store workers get highlighted a lot, and that makes sense as a central point of contact. But to me, it seems like the experts know what they're doing here in BC, and I'm not going to claim to know anything more than them on vaccine rollout strategies.
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of different views on how this goes. Probably the most out there one I saw was that irresponsible 20-somethings should get a relatively high priority just because they're more likely to be super spreaders through their irresponsibility. Not sure I necessarily buy that, or that doesn't introduce a lot of moral hazard into this, but
we should give it to the anti-maskers and the churches that are staying open, who will not want it anyway.
They probably wouldn't take it if offered, and that is going to be a problem later on. Right now, I'm not as worried about it, because if there's a 40-year-old anti-masker and anti-vax nut who doesn't take it, that just bumps me up the list a little quicker. But as the summer rolls around and we start nearing most people being vaccinated, that is going to increasingly become the concern. And so far, there isn't really much to address how the government plans to work around that. It is going to be voluntary. That's what's being announced so far, but vaccine hesitancy is definitely going to be a challenge.
I don't know that anyone has figured out exactly what level of vaccination we'll need to achieve community or herd immunity in this situation. You don't necessarily need 100%, but it's often 70, 80.
My understanding is basically the inverse of the R naught value.
So the more, there's also a variable number depending on how we're living.
No, that's the RT value. The R naught value would be fixed. The RT is the transmission at any given time, where R naught's the non-intervention transmission rate, where you're not doing anything to stop it. My understanding is that estimates put in kind of the 65 to 75 range. So like maybe anti-vaxxers aren't going to be a problem, but that hasn't been a for sure thing that's been worked out yet.
One of the other issues with the first vaccines coming out, and this won't be as big with the target populations they're going after, but it hasn't been tested or approved in people who are pregnant, the immunocompromised, or anyone under 16 years of age. Those populations will have to get vaccinated as well eventually. And there's, I believe, hopes that the other vaccines that are coming forward will be applicable for those groups. What is nice is that this vaccine has been tested on the elderly, and it seems like it works better than many vaccines, where I think I've heard people talk about how many vaccines don't actually work as well in seniors for a variety of reasons, but this one seems to hold up just as well, which is optimistic, given I think there were 28 deaths today, 26 of whom were elderly people in long-term care homes. Yeah, saving those lives will be important.
That's a reassuring sign for sure.
The only other person I saw got a mention as right at the front of the line for vaccine is today at the press conference, Dr. Bonnie Henry was asked to give some hope to children, expecting Santa Claus to come visit and wondering whether the restrictions would apply to him. And she said, "Don't worry, I have it on good authority. He's first in line for the vaccine. He'll probably have high immunity. He'll still need to wash his hands. Maybe don't put out the milk and cookies, though, for keeping things safe." It was a cute question and answer. I sometimes like that stuff. I do want to know when the politicians are going to get their vaccines, though, and will they slip themselves ahead in line or not? There are arguments for and against that happening. I don't know if they're frontline workers. Probably not.
They qualify as frontline workers, but you do want your senior levels of government to be functioning and not having to self-isolate and quarantine or just be out of commission for a couple of weeks because they actually catch the thing. So in that respect, that they may not be frontline workers, but definitely the premier, the people who work in his office, senior ministers, and then the important ministries and their staff, all fairly important, and should probably be ranked fairly highly as a result of that. Definitely, probably more so than just the general public in their demographic
Well, and politicians
categories.
also have a duty to go and meet with the public and be in the public more. And so politicians could be super spreaders, as Donald Trump seemed to have been a couple months ago. Our politicians are thankfully way more well behaved than Donald Trump, but to a certain extent, their job is to be among the people. Do you want to mention the data?
Yeah. So overall, this is a good news story. The interesting thing I want to briefly touch on, and this is something we skipped over discussing the last couple of weeks as it was in the news, is the politics around vaccine timelines and everything. It's a topic that hasn't really been seen provincially too much, but dominated federal politics for a couple of weeks, or at least was fairly prominent in there. And considering all of the good news that's in here, it's been interesting to watch the Liberals make a mess of things and struggle for several weeks to articulate a basic timeline or a basic kind of status of vaccine procurement. And as a result, they did not have a couple of good weeks at all, as the opposition was hammering them pretty hard on this in a pretty justified way.
Yeah, the federal Liberals. It was a weird situation where there was this leak about whether Canada was at the back of the line or not, and the Liberals just seemed to not be aware, or at least their comms team wasn't aware of what the Public Health Agency was aware of. And then you had Liberal partisans on Twitter being like, that's fine, we should welcome just anyone getting the vaccine. It's like, you don't need to just knee-jerk defend your party all the time. Like, sometimes they screw up. They all screw up.
Yeah, and they also kept falling back on this line of, we have the most vaccine doses per capita secured, which great, but if that means we got at them after everyone else, and every other country on the planet got vaccinated before the first dose got administered in Canada, that would be a big problem. And just having the most of something at some indefinite point of the future isn't all that helpful. And as a result, it looked like the government had a bunch of bad news they were hiding and being evasive about it. So naturally, the opposition kind of doubled down on this one and pushed them pretty hard. And as a result, the Liberals just took a bunch of wounds they didn't have to over the past, basically, month.
Transparency has been a difficult thing, I think, for many levels of government that we look at. The BC government has in some ways been somewhat transparent about elements of releasing COVID data regularly, but in a number of other ways, they've continued to refuse to release or even collect race-based data, for example. That has been called for by many groups, including the Human Rights Commissioner. They've long, until this past week, refused to regularly or very quickly update city level or local regional data on COVID-19, arguing privacy realms and the effect it could have on public health. This week,
which was a weird thing to say. So there's a story in the Abbotsford News where public health officials, after responding to requests from both junior levels of government, cities, as well as reporters, data scientists, various people were asking for the data, and they came out and basically said no, and it would be a threat to public health and privacy if we did release that, which you can maybe make the case for privacy if it was like super granular level, but just at the municipal level, it's unlikely to result in any privacy things. But most incoherently in that was if you tell people that they're what the COVID levels are, it's going to be
it's a very
threat to public health.
paternalistic approach that they've taken. It assumes that if certain cities or people in certain cities find out there aren't many cases in their city, that they will be more lax than those in places where there is a large number of cases. So instead, they try and just say, all of the interior has a growing number of cases, which everyone in BC should be taking the public health orders seriously. You get situations like in Fort St. John, where just in the last couple of days, 40 people have tested positive and the community is only 1,500. So these are like massive outbreaks where you are having to mobilize paramedics, and people in there need to be like extra cautious. I get that we want everyone being cautious in the province, but in that situation, that city basically needs to be shut down. It feels so.
Also, the mayors are the people asking for a lot of this data.
And there's an element that just, if you can trust people and you can treat them like adults and we can all work from the same data set, at least we can start to understand the decisions that are being made. This is part of what the frustration I think happened in Alberta, where the leaks came out from the cabinet discussions with Dr. Deena Hinshaw recommending things that the government rejected, and then the outbreak seemed to go harder. We don't know what options are being presented to our government. Like, people are starting to talk, should we have gone a more COVID zero approach where we tried to really stamp out the virus like they did in Australia and New Zealand and a number of other countries, and then have a more open situation after 6 weeks or less of a heavy lockdown?
I think that's, in retrospect, would have been the right decision. The countries that approached it with an eradication rather than we're just going to let the disease spread, but try and not let it spread too fast, definitely seem to be handling this better. And when it's all over, I hope there's a after action report written on the whole thing, or Royal Commission, or whatever form you want it to take, but a thorough and in-depth analysis on this, because there seems to be a lot of cases where BC, Canada in general, could have handled it a lot better. And there's a period there in the summer where we were like 10 to 15 cases a day. It would have been very possible at that point. I think, I'm not a public health person, but with a low amount of spread like that, dropping it a further 10 down to 0 doesn't seem infeasible on that. And if that had happened, maybe it would be the point where we can all go home for Christmas this year, because there wouldn't be any spread in BC, and that would have been really nice. So yeah, there's a lot of ways the government, public health in general, hasn't handled it better, and more data would be useful for that. And also, just on the paternalism point, part of effective public health is the kind of communications and trust between the public and the public health officer and the public health agency. And if it looks like the public health agency doesn't trust the public, people aren't necessarily going to respond to that well, and having people feel disrespected by public health for basically receiving the message that, we don't trust you, is the sort of thing that can undermine the long-term and broader efforts. Which is all to say, the position the public health agency took on data was rather baffling. Now, the good news is it was announced today that they're going to be changing the local health area data releases from monthly to weekly, which is a little better, but in the age of computers, it would sure be nice if that could just be updated daily the way case counts are.
So, yeah, it comes down to accountability, transparency, and it's not the time to second guess what's been done. We still have a lot to accomplish, but like you say, there's a lot of retrospective thinking that's going to need to be done, because if some of the more dire predictions are true, this is not likely to be our last pandemic because of the changing world that we live in.
And even if the world wasn't changing, these are the things that just happen with somewhat regular consistency. So taking the lessons from this and being able to be more effective next time, move quicker. In one hand, it's amazing that we have a vaccine that was developed and started to be distributed in less than a year. On the other hand, the vaccine itself from Moderna, it was whipped up in something like 2 days in January, which means that's a pretty long time between development and final approval. And it would sure be nice if we could find ways to compress that even further beyond the already impressive shortening of the timeline that was in the works this time.
Of compressing timelines, I think it's time to move on to our quick takes. Lynn Bayek is back in the news, the senator most popular among racists in Canada. She is officially back as a senator, as her prorogation back in August canceled the suspension she was on. And so senators who value not being among those loved by racists are looking at their tools at their disposal. And Senator Mary Jane McCallum has introduced a motion to expel Bayek from the Senate. This would be rather entirely unprecedented, as no senator has ever been expelled from the Canadian Senate, and it's not clear how easy it is to do. The Constitution Act, Section 18, only gives 5 ways a senator can be expelled. That is, missing 2 consecutive sessions, don't show up for work for effectively 2 years, if they have an allegiance or adherence to a foreign power, if you declare bankruptcy, commit treason or a felony, or if you do not meet the property qualifications. So if you sell your land, you could be kicked out of the Senate.
So does that mean that dual citizens can't be senators?
That's how I read it, to
Allegiance
some
to a
extent.
foreign power?
But it's unclear. Maybe they have to give up their citizenship.
Which would be another way of saying dual citizens can't be. Yeah, it's weird. I know Australia has rules about that, and there's been these hilarious scandals where people have been revealed to be secret Canadians and have had to resign, which is just such an amazing way to go out.
So there was a little more light shed on the questions of senator suspensions and expulsions in 2017, when then Senator Don Meredith was not going away, and other senators wanted him to because of his relationship with a 16-year-old girl, which seems improper. So senators were reviewing the tools at their disposal. They had their law clerk reviewed it, and they believe that the Constitution actually does give them the same powers as the House of Lords in the UK, which would mean they could expel a senator by a motion. Luckily, Meredith resigned before it came to that. It doesn't look like Bayek is going to take the dignified road out, so it'll be a debate to follow on this motion to expel her. It's so great having an appointed body.
So the only other thing I'm wondering
now... It's so
now,
great having an appointed for life body like this.
Yeah. So now the other thing I'm wondering is, if they don't meet the property qualifications, does that mean the government could expropriate their property, compensate them for it, fair market value, and effectively get them out of the Senate as a result?
I feel like that would end up in court.
Oh, no doubt end up in court, but I'm just trying to think through the implications of that list of ways to get expelled to the Senate. Huh. Well, that'll have to be a question for another time. Moving on, our next story is the Vancouver, Seattle, Portland proposed high-speed rail. is slowly moving forward. The rail may be high speed, but the process to get it built isn't necessarily that fast. But this week did see a new report be released by the Washington Department of Transportation. And this is the next phase in the study. So we talked last year when the business case analysis was completed. This time, we now have a strategic plan prepared that looks at the governance, planning the next stages, and how the fiscal strategy to support and fund this fairly expensive, somewhere on the order of 24 to 42 billion American dollars. How that project gets funded.
You're underselling it, Scott. This is a framework for the future, as it's titled. It's a much less exciting report for people who just want to know how fast, how big this train will be. That was all done in the previous report last year. 400 kilometers an hour, 1 hour from Vancouver to Seattle, 1 hour from Seattle to Portland. And the costs and the revenue and the business case was all done. So yeah, this is the how do you nuts and bolts make this happen? And it proposes creating a new coordinating organization to essentially liaise all the different levels of governments across the border, as well as bringing on the public and stakeholders. Not as exciting, important steps to actually make this go from yet another study to something that actually happens. While we're talking about reports, there were 2 more reports that came out here in British Columbia, both interim reports, so I don't think there were too much digging into. The Cullen Commission Inquiry into Money Laundering in BC released its interim report, which I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And then I skimmed it and I realized it's not. It's basically just repeating what they're going to do, who they're going to talk to, and how they're going to work, which that's great. Why did you need to write this as a report? The only interesting thing that's in there is that the federal government has not been super forthcoming with the documents that the commission has requested, redacting things, etc., but does suggest that relations are improving.
That's pretty much the federal government's job, isn't it, to irritate the provinces?
They also do that to the opposition with redactions and so forth, as we've seen in the last year. The other interim report to come out is the expert panel on the future of housing supply and affordability. And this report is a bit like one of the Plecas reports we talked about last week, where it's just a collection of the ideas that they've heard without any endorsement of them. It's just, these are things that people are saying. More and more people are talking about housing, it turns out. They do recommend people come to the panel's website, and we'll link it in the show notes before January 15th, and submit your own ideas and your own recommendations for how to make housing more affordable.
Yeah, there's a long list of items in there that they've heard from people. There's quite a few actually pretty decent ones in there that could use a little boosting. So if you want to let the government know, and this expert panel, where you think we should be going on housing, you can head over to the website and put your thoughts into that. The list of possible actions in there is quite broad, including a much more kind of aggressive provincial role for how, in terms of overseeing the housing system and everything. So naturally, the question is, when the final report comes out, will that actually be followed through on, or is this just going to be another item that governments commission and don't adhere to all the recommendations on?
We definitely look forward to reading that report when it's done. Maybe we'll try and reach out to some of the panelists to get them on. The show. And to close off, it turns out Ellen Mullen and Darryl Plecas are in the news once more, as a really weird story came out this past week that apparently the case for the mace of the legislature, the mace case, had been tampered with in late October, just after the end of the election. I guess the
So the Mace case is being defaced, is what you're trying to say?
Yeah. Alan Mullen had discovered this and started investigating it as he was wont to do. The alarm system on it wasn't working. So essentially, someone could have opened the case, taken the mace, and the alarms wouldn't have gone off. The screws had been removed, the connections were unplugged, but the mace thankfully had not been stolen in this time. This leads Mullen to speculate to the news that he is of the opinion, and the former speaker is of the opinion, and others say the only reasonable explanation is that a listening device is in the speaker's office.
That's...
More and more people are saying they bugged the speaker's office.
Well, that's certainly a theory.
Mike Farnworth has another theory that it may have just not been plugged in properly. Nevertheless, Victoria Police have been called in to assist the investigation.
Hopefully we'll find out what's happening there. It's going to be a different legislature without all this off-the-cuff speculation by Mullen and company.
Yeah, new Speaker Raj Chauhan hasn't said whether he will retain the Chief of Staff position. I don't think Alan Mullen will be the continuing Chief of Staff to the Speaker, but who knows? It would keep some color to the back of the legislature. I think Chauhan's debut speech as Speaker when he accepted it was that he wanted to focus on efficiency, which in terms of parliamentary procedure is like fine, but
where's the truckloads full of alcohol adding some color to the speakers going on?
Clean up the back room, but he, I think, also talked a lot about decorum and making sure the legislature moved efficiently, which seems like a way to quietly talk down the importance of the opposition holding the government to account, which is often not efficient. Don't get me wrong, Chauhan's still a historic choice as, I think, the first speaker in British Columbia's history who's of South Asian descent. He comes from a really interesting background in working in Fraser Valley labor organizing. A very good pick, but I hope he doesn't focus too much on efficiency and instead finds out more about where all the money went. Put that wood splitter to good use.
Yeah, they should just auction that thing off as a bit of BC Poly memorabilia. It would probably actually fetch a decent price.
They can use the funds to seismically upgrade the building so it doesn't collapse. Jesus.
Might not fetch that higher price. Either that or just send it to the BC Museum as part of a new exhibit or something on BC political history.
Whoever planted the alleged bug in there will find out what Raj Chauhan is going to be up to.
And that has been Politicoast. Find links to everything we talked about at politicoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/Politicoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikov. Politicoast is a production of Legend Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.